Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, guys. Lovely to see everyone. Lots of familiar faces. Nice to see. Nice to see you guys all here. So welcome to this webinar. I will pass you on to Simon straight away, who will be hosting this webinar. Thank you again for joining. Simon, on to you.
Great, thank you. Happy New Year to those that I have not spoken to yet, and thank you for checking in for our first food for thought of the year, our lunchtime webinar. We try and get as close to lunchtime as possible, and we don't give anyone any lunch, so it's a kind of a bit of a short straw on that. I'm going to get straight into it. The title is enticing, and really the purpose of today's webinar is to try and help us consider how we plan over the next phase. So I'm going to talk for a bit, and we'll see how we get on. So I'm going to share a screen, and hopefully you can all see that screen. And if anyone does not come off mute, then I'm assuming that you can. So the title is, Does a Roaring Twenties Revival Await Us Post-Pandemic? And we'll try and discuss that. I want to start with a quote, actually, I heard on the 4th, my first day back, when I was shaving to go nowhere on the 4th of January. And I'll read it out rather than let you read it. I'll just put out the key bits. But it's by Laura Lambie, who does an occasional slot on one of the radio stations. And she's a very articulate investment director at Investec. But I liked what she said. It stopped me in my mid-shave. And she said that well-managed companies with manageable gearing, so that's the kind of debt to performance ratio, she thinks will rise out of this, but she acknowledges that there's a huge amount of headwinds in the short term. And she says she doesn't envy businesses at the sharp end, and I think we pretty much say that we are at the sharp end. And she goes on to say, and I think this is the bit that really resonated with me, that there's really no way of anticipating what is going to happen, what government restrictions will apply. And as business leaders, we need to be able to take a long-term view. That's what we have to do. We need to work out where we're going to invest in people, in capex, in strategies, in products. And if we don't know one day to the next, if we're going to be able to, or how much of our market we can sell to, then it makes it very difficult for us to make long-term plans, which is what we should be doing to enable our progress, prosperity, and in some cases survival. So this kind of stopped me mid-shave, and it really resonated with me as one of the real challenges that we've had over the last 9 months. We don't know what's coming next. Now, I wanted, and some of you heard me say this, I wanted 2 things for Christmas. I wanted a vaccine, not in my arm, but an approved vaccine, and I wanted a Brexit trade deal, or a trade deal, really, to be honest. And we got both of those. And so I think that with some increasing certainty, and I say increasing, I don't think it's there yet, about the vaccine rollout program and the trade deal, as a business community, we can now begin, I think, to make some assumptions about what the passage out looks like, and we begin to take some educated guesses and produce a planning framework against which we can hopefully make some decisions. And I've done that. I've done a starter for 10, and I want to share it with you. But I also want alternative viewpoints. And I want you guys to challenge it. I must admit, I feel quite apprehensive about this, partly because I follow in the footsteps of Nick, who does very eloquent and factual and detailed webinars, and I don't think I can meet that standard. But the second reason I feel apprehensive is because I'm kind of caveating this, that I'm not an expert on anything that I'm talking about. I'm trying to fill a void, and I have to do it in my business. and I'm presumptuous enough to want to share it. And therefore, doing nothing, saying nothing is not something that I think I should do, and therefore I'm prepared to put myself out there, and I'm prepared to be criticised, or I'm prepared for these views to be challenged. And I think that's really important because I'm no better qualified than you guys are to make these points. Now, my father, and I thought my father invented this, but it turned out this phrase, but it turned out it didn't. Some guy called Milton Friedman, who's a very famous economist, and he said there's no such thing as a free lunch. Now, that's a bit weird because I'm not providing you with any lunch, and it's a loose tangent to the fact that it's lunchtime. But what I'm saying there is I really want some input on this. So, because I'm going to talk about stuff that everyone can have a view on. And so because I'm putting myself out there, where you can, I'd really like you to chuck comments in the chat function. And it's really helpful for me as well. And I think it's helpful for everyone because it will help either validate or adjust or critique some of the points that I'm going to make. So please try and be active. It would be really supportive for me, and I'll be really grateful. Okay, so I've done some analysis, desk research really, to try and formulate the views I've created, and I wanted to quickly share some of that analysis with you. I've used a bit business schooly, but I've used the Pestel framework. It doesn't matter what framework you use; it just helps you structure it. And it looks at the political, economic, social, technological. I put vaccine in there, environmental and legal factors. And this is the framework that I've used to try and form some judgment on what the next chapters look like. So I'm going to trot on this quite quickly, but I either turn your mic on or chuck something in chat. And Alina, I can't do two things at the same time as you tell me. So keep an eye on chat, please.
No worries.
So from a political point of view, I think that there's a perception, and perhaps it's a reality, but there's a general widespread opinion that we as the UK have not handled the pandemic very well. And I think that the vaccination program actually offers us some kind of, I say us, probably the government, some kind of absolution. And I think there's a shift actually in the way that they're going to start communicating with us, where they're going to try not to overpromise and underdeliver, and try and do the opposite. And so therefore, towards the end of the year and the beginning of this year, it's become a little bit more complicated to try and unpick exactly what they're saying. And probably more reliable if you can unpick it, because last year was complete chaos. But I think that's a dynamic that we need to consider. We also, playing in the minds of our government will be that we have performed very badly on a blended, if you want, a blended ratio of health and wealth, not health and wealth, sorry, well, health and economics. We're pretty much the worst European country. So they won't like that stat. Now, each European country has very different dynamics, so I'm not sure it's a fair comparison, but people do that comparison. And this is not a political point, I think it's just a doctrine, it's a statement of their doctrine, but the Conservatives, and I think particularly Boris Johnson, are not a party that like to impose restrictions. And consequently, there's quite a strong presence on the backbenches of the 1922 committee, and they've now formed, because can't talk about Brexit anymore, so they're talking about COVID and this COVID recovery group, which is about 50 MPs that are very active in actually trying to change the way that the government legislates on restrictions, on lockdown. They're trying to say that at each gate, each month actually, further restrictions should be voted on, rather than this kind of blank check on restrictions. So, and that is gathering some weight actually. So that's definitely something that is being considered. There's obviously pressure from the devolved. I'm not making any political points here. But my namesake Mark Drakeford in Wales and Nicola Sturgeon are quite forthcoming, and there's some game playing, I think, on who plays around with what restrictions across the UK, and I think that is an influencing factor as well, because I think all three leaders are worried about kind of being benchmarked and compared in the UK and in Europe. The government have been quite clear on and I think the reason why I'm talking about restrictions, and this is a lot of what I talk about lockdown today, because I think when we lift out of lockdown, we see we see a change in the way that our businesses will perform. So that's why it's so critical that we interrogate this. And the government has been clear, actually, on the 4 criteria when assessing when restrictions might be lifted. And they are the number of deaths declining, that no new variants or mutations, that the vaccination efficacy and the rollout targets are being hit, and that there's a lightening on the horrendous pressure that's on the NHS, that begins to lighten. So that's they are saying 4 clear criteria. What they are less clear on, and this is, I find this frustrating, is any targets or measurements against that. So number of deaths declining, by how much? And no new variants. Viruses mutate the whole time. It's whether there's an issue with the mutation. And again, rollout targets. Well, I think we have those actually. There are some states in the ground, but the efficacy of vaccination is unclear. And of course, how do you measure pressure on the NHS? But it's giving us some guidelines. And I have to say that that I don't talk about Brexit a great deal, but the pain of Brexit, and I'm afraid that there is pain coming. The pain of Brexit will kind of add into the mix of disquiet and unrest that the government has to manage, because ultimately it's a democracy and popularity is their trade. So that's quickly how I looked at the political landscape and tried to consider what influencing factors might be there from an economic perspective. Now, if you haven't, and I think we're going to open them up a bit wider, but if you haven't, Nick Wilson did 2 very good webinars on the kind of macroeconomic and slightly microeconomic environment over last year, and a lot of what was in there is playing out. And so, if you get time and you're bored or interested, probably a better way of saying it, then go back and have a look at those. So I'm not going to repeat Nick's messaging, and I'm going to make it specific to us trying to plan our way out. We don't know the impact of lockdown 3.0, but I can tell you, as I think you know if you watch those webinars, that the impact of lockdown 1.0, or the kind of March 21st lockdown, was really, really severe. I can't say that word, but you know what I mean. We went in and we had a very, very deep decline. Now, it feels like, and most people are reporting, that this lockdown is less severe. I'm just going to avoid the word, less tight than lockdown 1. However, we are going to see a significant impact on GDP. I'm hoping it's not 21.7. Normal kind of recessionary declines are around 2-3%. So to have a large double-digit decline is pretty scary, but we are going to see something like that, and that just can't carry on. We just can't cope with that. So that will be playing in everyone's mind. On a more positive note, and I think many of you heard me say this before, and this number is ticking up every day that we're in lockdown, there is estimated to be 120 billion in the UK of unspent consumer income, household income, or household income. So there is a kind of piece of pent up demand here. There's only so much you can spend in B&Q and Wix when you're locked down, so that is a kind of a positive, I think. A positive and a negative, or potential negative, and I'll talk about this a little bit. Interest rates are currently very low. But of course, if we see, which I'm going to talk about, a sharp increase in consumer spending, then that will drive up inflation. We know that. There are other inflationary pressures as well. And in traditional monetary policy, you control interest rates. You control inflation with interest rates. So if we have to start, if the Bank of England and the government have to start pushing up interest rates, that is quite scary if we're trying to lift out of this. There's also, and actually we're going to see this more than I thought and quicker than I thought, mainly because of the cost of freight, the dramatic increase in the cost of freight that is now beginning to hit our supply chain. But we are going to see inflationary pressures as a result of Brexit. I mean, well predicted. Whether interest rates are the right way of combating that, I don't know, but that's something that we need to think about. I won't go into this too much, but the amount of borrowing, as we've talked about before, and Nick talks about, is very scary and continues to be scary, as the schemes continue. I have to say that the way the quantitative easing and therefore the borrowing is a way that most nations actually are funding all these support schemes. Quantitative easing is becoming less scary in some economic kind of economic thinking on this new modern monetary theory, which basically says that if you print money and put it into an economy, you're actually creating a surplus that matches the deficit that you're creating with the debt. It's quite complicated. I think I understand it, but some people are saying, well, we can just carry on printing money as long as it creates a surplus in the people's pocket, as long as it's spent on the right thing. It's Bernie Sanders' kind of theory, not his theory, but that's what he was preaching. So I don't know whether that has an influence on using interest rates to control inflation or not, and whether that will play out. I thought that was quite interesting. And I think there's the economic, I talk about the social, but the economic impact of schools being closed is, and actually this is the bit that's beginning to, it's been talked about for a while, but less talked about in lockdown 1, but being talked about a lot more now, is the future impact of lockdown. Obviously, we've got to control the pressure on the NHS, but the future impact of the restrictions that we have right now is really scary. And there's some fascinating modelling on the loss of income, loss of future income that comes from substandard education to our children or whoever it is, and over 80 to 100 years of economic depression, because earnings are lower, because education is poorer, and that means GDP and innovation is lower, particularly in the UK when you compare that with other nations, where in some cases schools haven't been closed, or schools were closed, particularly in Asia, for a very short period. So I think that's pretty scary, and obviously that's not a now, but that's definitely a next and a later. So that will be playing in the minds of the government. From a social perspective, well, there's ongoing concerns about a kind of a growing mental health crisis, and I don't mean that we all feel pretty low with the circumstances. I mean that the clinical mental health crisis, there's always bubbling anyway, and through austerity there was a significant decrease in investment in mental health. And they're trying to increase the investment in it. But actually, it's the Institute of Fiscal Studies that says the pandemic has driven a decline in mental health of 8.1%. And that's a staggering figure. I mean, how they measure that, I don't know. This is just desk research. And I thought it was interesting that this is most keenly seen, if that's the right word, in regrettably, in young adults and women. And if I just take the young adults bit, obviously there's a tension there, because young adults are the ones that the future will be most impacted by this. Mental health is most impacted, education is most impacted, but also they ride the virus in the lightest possible way. So from a social kind of control perspective, I think that's a challenge for how much longer we can lock down a generation that isn't so impacted by this. And I think I'm kind of saying the same thing, which is I think ongoing restrictions will be definitely more difficult to control and police if the R rate begins to drop, which touch wood it is, and most of the vulnerable have been vaccinated. So I'm sure that is playing out. And we all know that there's significant cabin fever. I think we've all got it. So I'm just, I'm not going further forward in my planning cycles than November. I'm not thinking about next winter yet. I can't bring myself to do that. But if we don't get control if we don't create some kind of immunity, then there's the potential that loosening of restrictions over summer may cause some drama next winter. But I guess let's not think about that yet. There's also quite a lot of research that says the difference to lockdown 1 and lockdown 3 is that people are actually craving interaction, and that people now want to return to offices, not full time, okay, but they want to return to offices. And if you remember lockdown 1, everyone got super excited. The weather was nice, there was no commute, and everyone's going, this is great, I'm never going back to the office again, right? And I'm all moving out to the country, and everything's just, forget work. Now, the reality now is a lot of people are saying, I really miss the office. Not all aspects of it and not every day, which is why we're predicting this hybrid thing. But that research, and it's not particularly robust at the moment, but I think that research is particularly applicable for us, for our industry. So I was interested in that. And there's also a diverse attitude towards lockdown restrictions. And this is socio-demographic, it's geographical, it's ethnic, and so it makes it ongoing quite difficult to universally control. Police, if you want, which is the kind of stick, or the carrot as well. I think I've talked about schools, but in a social way, I think there's a lot of pressure, apart from economic. I think there's a lot of pressure to open up schools. And I guess the bad news, if you want, is that, and I thought this was interesting, and this is kind of only the first week of January, and data is emerging from the first week of January. And some of you would have seen some data that emerged this morning from Imperial College London. But the infection rate, or the R rate, is still going up in the second week of January in the oldest population, which I thought was interesting. I don't know why, but so technologically, this is where I kind of talk about the vaccine, because I think the vaccine is absolutely scientific, but science and technology, normally can be bedfellows. And I thought this was where I should put it. So you'll know that our target is to inoculate 500,000 people a week, which is absolutely staggering from a standing start. I do think that the NHS is well positioned to do this, and a lot of people think this as well. It's a kind of centrally controlled monolith where you can play out aggressive rollout programs. Obviously, there's some downside to the structure, but for programs like this, I think it's a lot easier to do that than I think other countries' health services are a different blend between private and public. Whereas perhaps the NHS is well positioned, and I think our fast start probably proves that. The David Mackey is an economist at JP Morgan. He drew a direct correlation, which is important because it's one of the government's criteria, between the vaccine rollout and the amount of people going into hospital, if the efficacy rates on the vaccine proves to be right. And that, I think, is really quite encouraging as well, actually, because we need to see the pressure on the NHS go down. Otherwise, no one's lifting out. I think they've made that quite clear. There are at the moment a little bit of challenges on the vaccine rollout. Some of you will probably know this. They were very optimistic about the 15th of February as the target date for the priority groups, and they are less confident about it now because I think it's the Belgian Pfizer plant have come offline for a bit, so that they can update their manufacturing processes. I don't know exactly what's going on, so that they can produce a much greater yield further on in the year. However, this has slowed down the supply of the vaccine, which is something that we probably need to consider. They are saying that it will open up, and so it's just right now that it's hurting us. There's quite interesting stuff about testing, which was often seen as the way out of this. And you remember, I don't want to talk about the cost and the failure, if you want, of the test and trace solution that we had before the vaccine. But there's a lot of information about how different testing is a bit complicated, PCR is a very thorough test, but I believe it can pick up non-transmitting levels of viral load, which basically means you're locking down a whole lot of people unnecessarily. And conversely, you've got the lateral flow test that some of you, including us, are selling right now, where people are, the general scientific view on this is that it should be a red light if it's a positive test. So if you get a positive result, as in you've got COVID from a lateral flow, then don't go anywhere, isolate. But if you get a green light, it doesn't mean you can go. It doesn't mean you can go out effectively. And I think that's why they changed the school policy, where they were just going to do mass lateral flow testing because it's easy to do, and that would enable schools to reopen. I think that's why they're revisiting that. So there's constant fluctuations in all of this. We haven't got this key answer yet, which is does the vaccine reduce transmission? That says transition. I don't think that's what I mean. And that is, I think that's going to come in the next week or so, that piece of information. And that will be absolutely critical as to how quickly we lift out. If it doesn't, it's really not very good news. If it does, it's as good as news as the vaccine being approved in terms of lift out. And obviously we talked about viral strains. We're a bit unsure, particularly I think on the Brazilian strain now. I love the way they're given national, the national brands. But I think the Brazilian strain, we're not sure whether the vaccines can cope with it. But most of the production, most of the scientists involved in the technology behind the vaccines say that it doesn't take long to adjust the vaccine to a new strain, but it still takes some time. And that's kind of what we're slightly worried about. And emerging concern again today about the efficacy of a single dose strategy, particularly on the AZ vaccine, which some of you would have read. So this is where we changed from doing 2 vaccines within, I think, 2 doses within whatever it was, 10 to 12 days, to stretching that to 12 weeks. And there's some concern about what level of immunization the first dose gives on its own. So lots of moving parts there. I think the biggest one, really, the biggest 2 bits are how many vaccines can we do? How quickly can we get those that are at risk and also causing the issues in the NHS? How quickly can we get them vaccinated? And does vaccination reduce the transmission of it? Are the 2 bits that I think are really good. And in terms of herd immunity, most of you would have heard of this guy who was advising Trump, which must be fun. Must have been fun. But he believes that you get herd immunity when 70 to 80% of the population is vaccinated. And we believe that we can do our current run rate 100% of the over 18s by August. Now, what I'm unclear on is how important it is that the under 18s are vaccinated as well. I think that would be important because I think there's various debates on how virulent schools are. But certainly herd immunity is where we want to get to. So there's a whole lot there on vaccine. I'm not checking chat. In case there's any really good points in here. Environmental. I haven't got too much on environmental. I think there was some debate early on as to whether it was airborne or not, and I think they've pretty much confirmed it is airborne. And that means highly ventilated areas are safer. And obviously, come the summer, you kind of get better ventilation. So I'm kind of thinking and hoping that spring and summer will bring lower infection rates as we spend more time outside and more time with the windows open. Conversely to that, specific to office space and schools, I think most modern offices are not well ventilated. Because they have to comply with a lot of energy regulations, and energy regulations are not they tend to kind of restrict ventilation or have artificial ventilation, and I don't think it survives that long in the air. So I don't think you're going to get it going around in air conditioning units, but I think infection rate will go up with ventilation. So that is a point that I thought environmentally was worth considering. And legally, I'm not going to go through too much on this. suffice to say, I think that oh, well, I'll send the slides out afterwards, but the 2021 was seen, I believe, as a year of where there was going to be significant new legislation introduced, partly because of we were no longer part of the EU, so we could, not my words, but take control of our legislation, and partly because some of the legislation, there was just a gap, because before our legislation came out of the EU. So there's lots of changes to legislation. I think probably the most important bit on here, not well positioned out here, but is that the CGRS, the furlough scheme, is scheduled to end in April, and whether they extend that again, I think really depends on whether we lift out or not. But we talked earlier about the costs of these schemes, and I think there will be a lot of pressure, particularly from facets in the Conservative Party that are influential, to try and reduce the amount of borrowing and spending. The hard right of the hard right's wrong phrase. Sorry, the right wing tend to be less. They tend to believe less in the modern monetary theory and tend to prefer traditional monetary policy, where you use interest rates to control inflation, and the borrowing should be kept within a manageable level. So I haven't checked chat, but that's the summary of some of my desk research, looking at the different areas. And why I did that wasn't really to bore you over lunch, but was to just give you some, and give myself really some knowledge to try and base some assumptions on the different planning phases, which is what I really think we need. And if we trot back to the comment I made at the beginning, and the quote from Roland was that we need to make decisions when we run businesses to ensure our survival, and we need to plan where we're going to invest and what we're going to do. And the overriding characteristic in our personal lives, I think, but as well as our business lives over the last 9 months, is that we just haven't been able to plan, because we don't know what's happening next. So I've done some research, which some of the highlights I've presented to you, and now I'm going to talk about the different phases. Now, I did this on the 4th of January, so obviously some of the research is updated, but I haven't actually changed the time periods here. And I had an initial phase of now, which is the 4th of January to the 15th of March. And I was calling this phase the Ides of March. Now, the Ides of March, the classicist amongst you, is the 15th of March. It's a date in the Roman calendar. It's when Caesar was, I didn't also know it's when all debts were supposed to be paid back, but it's when Caesar was stabbed by Brutus, amongst other people. And it marks the death of Caesar. And so when I was planning in January, I thought, cool, well, it's 15th of March. That's what the 15th of February is when they targeted to get all the high risk vaccinated by. It takes 10 to 14 days for the vaccination, in theory, to take effect. So then I was thinking, well, you roll that out in a couple of weeks further, and you get the 15th of March. And I went 15th of March, the Ides of March, the death of Caesar, the death of COVID. So that's the only reason I've called it that. You can move the 15th of March by 2 weeks that way or 2 weeks that way. I think really it's the characteristics of this period. And this period is, I think, a settle in and stay safe. And I'm calling it settle in and stay safe because we'll be locked down. I think we'll be controlled. That lockdown is controlled through vaccine optimism. So we're all going, well, we can do this, we can do it because the end is in sight. And social pressure. That lovely lady, Priti Patel, saying that we should now shop our neighbours if they're behaving, if they're breaking the regulations. So that is social pressure. You do your bit for the war effort, which was what we saw quite effectively controlling restrictions in lockdown 1. And I think we're all seeing this, but business activity, particularly in non-critical sectors, will be very slow, and if not mothballed. So phase 1, I am calling the Ides of March, and from now till whenever you think we'll see the right level of results from vaccination. Key characteristics during the period, well, it's going to be lockdown. We've got this horrible pandemic fatigue. I don't know if anyone's read about this, but it's why we all felt so a bit blah when we came back at the start of January. We've been in very high levels of stress for 9 months, personal and business. And when you're stressed, you release something called cortisol from your adrenal gland to help deal with the stress. It's a bit like adrenaline. I think it's related to adrenaline. Alina knows more about this than I do. And the way that you counterbalance that is through serotonin, the kind of happiness hormone or happiness drug. We haven't had much happiness, and we've just had a significant load of cortisol. And over time, if you can't balance that out, then you basically get really lethargic and fed up, and all probably the stuff that we're feeling. And people are calling that pandemic fatigue, and that I think is going to be a characteristic of this period until we get a lift out. Homeschooling kind of adds to it. If anyone's homeschooling, you have my utmost respect and sympathies. It's really tough, and obviously we've got to protect all the key services, the NHS being the number one. I think key product areas for us. Well, I think as people settle in and realise that homeschooling doesn't, I might need a special area, or home working is not going to disappear, maybe ever. Then I think home furniture, home computing, that boom that we saw lockdown 1.0, I think we're going to see some more stuff there. Some PPE, although not maybe as much PPE as the first wave, but definitely testing. And if you're an office plan dealer, and you want to get involved in our lateral flow and antibody test, then you know where we are. And I think packaging, because e-commerce across the board, the mix shift from offline to online is one of the most seismic kind of business characteristics. But we've talked about that a lot, and I think packaging for us, if we can make it happen, not an easy supply chain. From a sales and marketing perspective, I think we'll see a dominance in e-commerce. I would encourage us all to broadcast email, but just brand awareness. I think it's going to be very difficult to be too specific about what sort of products people might want to buy, and you don't even know if businesses are, businesses are open. So brand awareness, brand awareness is probably the way to go. If you do and you have staff or you want to do it yourself, I think proactive telesales to active customers. I think it's going to be really expensive to try and find active customers, depending on how well you know your base, how big your base is, and how good your CRM systems are. Or active sectors is probably a way of doing it. And we will see spike in orders, and we see them with some really volatile demand patterns. And from a financing and corporate position, well, we know that the furlough scheme is going to continue until April, so that's really positive, and I think that does promote the survival of businesses, but it also means that there's a lot of mothballing going on, which is quite difficult if you're selling to businesses, because they're just basically not there. I think it's really important. I think businesses will continue to look at their headcount, and I think where we saw a wave of redundancies when we thought the furlough scheme was going to end, I think people will now be looking at, and we'll see employment. I haven't talked about that, but unemployment had a spike, flattened out, and is continuing, and actually is beginning to rise again. And I think that's something that we'll see during this period. Obviously, tighter cost controls, which is not great. And then I talk about this later, but if you can build a war chest, I mean, it seems so unlikely and unrealistic. But one of the characteristics in the latter phases is that you actually need working capital to grow. So if we do see a lift out, we're going to need capital to support that growth. Okay, moving on a bit more positively. So 15th of March, we'll put whatever date on, and maybe a more realistic date might be Easter. But they were hoping that schools were going to go back on the 15th. Gavin Williamson is uncommittal on that. He still says that their ambition is to bring schools back before Easter. I think it's quite challenged, particularly with the scrutiny on the testing, but I think from the 15th of March or from April, possibly till summer really kicks in, we're going to see what I'm calling the resurrection phase. Okay, it ties in nicely with Easter, obviously. So the characteristics of this phase, I think, I'm sorry, the kind of positioning is I think it will give us some normal compared with now. I'm really hoping we'll get some normal. I think there will be a loosening of regional restrictions that will lead to schools and businesses opening up again. However, I do think that most restrictions on hospitality and travel will probably continue. I don't think we're going to suddenly all all holidays and all pubs and restaurants will open up again, or certainly I would be surprised on that. Key characteristics. So as I said, schools returned, loosening. I think tiered, as we know. I mean that's pretty much been very clear. Tiered. I think there will be some return to offices. I really genuinely think this, and I think therefore there's going to be a focus on making sure those offices are secure. And I think there will be, whether staycations is the right word, but I think people will want to get out and travel around the UK. And obviously, it depends on what leisure is available, but there's lots of people that haven't seen their families for very long. And so I think we'll see a kind of some kind of travel under restrictions. Key product areas, well, PPE, I think, actually, as people go back into offices, I think consumption on PPE is down because everyone's at home. But I think that will go up for us. I think testing, it depends on what happens with testing. But I think the kind of red light of testing on lateral flow, the swab tests now that are a lot more pleasant than lateral flow. I think there's a big opportunity for COVID secure fit outs. I think that did happen at the end of lockdown 1, but then it dropped off so quickly that people kind of didn't bother. I think this time we will potentially see more of that. Filing and archiving, potentially, I think it will be postponed from the normal January high, where everyone comes back and has to do their filing. You're obviously allowed to, there's an extension on when you have to do a lot of your filing, electronically and otherwise. So I think that might be pushed out, and it's difficult to do it if you're not in the office. So when people return, they will want to get organised. They might even relocate offices or adjust their offices internally. And I think as businesses begin to relaunch, I think we'll see some print activity potentially as well, because you need to communicate, and that isn't all done online. From a sales and marketing, I think e-commerce will prevail. I think it's worth doing proactive telesales to larger customers. Still see spike in orders, I think, particularly around COVID secure stuff. And I think some really targeted using STP, so segmentation, targeting and positioning through your CRM and email systems out to those sectors that we know are opening up, or those geographies that are opening up. I think would be really a really good thing to do. And I think I'm really keen on geographical targeting, because I think that's the way that the tiered restrictions will play out. And then I guess this is probably the pinch point phase here a little bit, which is, well, if the CJRS, if furlough scheme does stop, then where are you on any growth? I mean but where is a business on any growth to be able to cover that cost? This is the period where the deferred government cost, the deferred tax, needs to be paid, VAT and PAYE. So will they extend that, or if they hold that, that's going to be a big issue. There's already talk that the government is going to, Rishi Dishi's March budget is going to increase corporation tax. That doesn't impact everyone. You've got to be making a profit to pay that, but that will definitely impact some businesses. And actually, at this point around credit and working capital, where do you get the cash from that you need to be able to grow out? Particularly if there are big chunky orders, someone needs to pay for that at some point somewhere in the supply chain. So that's the resurrection phase, and then here we are. Then this is the one that we've been waiting for, or I have. It's the 30th of June to, hopefully forever. But I've just put an end date in on winter, and I'm calling it the Roaring Twenties, and I think that's borrowed from the media. But I'm kind of thinking if I mention this enough, then it might actually happen. So that's part of my strategy. And I'm calling this the recovery through pursuits of happiness. Again, you know, I might be going crazy, and I think that most risk by the 30th of June will have been immunised, and I think that the warm weather will enable these really low tier national restrictions now, and this pent up spending, pent up demand will flow out into the economy as everyone searches for kind of interactions, both kind of social and business. I mean, it sounds amazing. The key characteristics, well, I think there's leisure, pleasure, and travel. I could just stop there, and we could all dream. I think we have got this challenge with extended holidays, where everyone's going to want to take holidays, and that's not always good for our business. But I think we're also going to see widespread opening of service sector offices. Now, I don't mean that every bank in the city is going to open up again, but I do think that this hybrid model, people will want to come in, and people will want to meet, and that means some of the kind of feeder businesses that feed off some of the big offices will see some revival as well. I mean, it's how much it's a Roaring Twenties or kind of a springtime. I don't know, but that's what I'm hoping for. Key product areas. Well, I actually think core stationery, paper, and EOS might make a mini revival as we kind of go back to some sort of normal business. I mean, vastly reduced on where it was pre-pandemic, but an improvement on where it is right now. I think we'll probably see some push on the kind of branded merchandising, relaunching of business. You'll have conferences in theory, conferences and events could be allowed, and I think that will drive some branded merchandising potentially. And I think PPE and testing is going to stay. I mean, particularly as things open up, it's not going to be everyone free for all. You can do what you want. They're going to be opened up with, well, I hope they'll be opened up with some tight restrictions on it, and that means there's an opportunity for dials down the Roaring Twenties a little bit, but it's safe and secure, and so I think there's probably opportunities for that as well. Sales and marketing still be e-commerce, but I actually think you'll get some reactive telesales. I think people will be hunting for stuff like they were in the boom days of lockdown one. There's very hunting for different things, but with a boom comes the adjustment between supply and demand. I think that you'll see category extensions because you'll get broad demand patterns, and the more that we can position ourselves as a one-stop shop, I think the more likely we are to kind of get the results of a boom. And then from a finance and corporate view, well, this is where I think inflationary pressures might come in. And again, I'm slightly worried about interest rates, but I'm really not an expert on this at all, or anything, but definitely particularly this point. But it will potentially put pressure on business borrowing, and also obviously invoice discounting, which is just a form of that, which I know some big businesses in our supply chain and small ones use. But let's not worry about that bit at the moment. Let's just focus on the top part of that chart, which is the leisure, pleasure, and travel, and the boom that pent-up demand might bring. And again, just a caveat, because this is going to be shared, and come November, everyone play it back to me and say none of that happened. You talk bollocks, excuse my language. But you can play around with the phases and the dates as you see fit. But I think these are the three phases that we're going to plan out. This is the same data, or the same, I wouldn't call it data, the same views on a different sheet, with the three different kind of planning phases, and that's what we're looking at, and it's helpful for when I share it. Thank you, Joe, very much for your comment. Rather predictably, because I know this happens, and I dialed up the begging for feedback into chat, but there's been no feedback. So that's probably because I didn't provide you with any lunch. So maybe the next food for thought, I will send you lunch, and then you have to put some impact, put some views in there. but maybe you've all been so fascinated and engrossed that you haven't had time to chat, or maybe the opposite. So to conclude, well, I think the key dynamics of 2021, I think there's going to be cash and credit challenges in supporting growth, because I don't think by the time we get there, there's a great deal of working capital or cash sloshing around in our supply chain. So I'm not quite sure where the risk is taken, particularly if everyone needs to pay back some of the debt that they built up. I think e-commerce and home deliveries will prevail, so we need to be geared for that. As kind of, there will be a return to offices, I think. This is all my thinking, not fact. But a hybrid will also just be, it will be prevalent. I think demand patterns will remain volatile. I really see that. I think mini rushes will continue, but they will be risky. You know, there were some people talking about testing kind of 2 or 3 months ago, but not that many. Some very smart early entrepreneurs, you know, manufactured and got them approved and are now making hay. There potentially will be something else. We didn't really predict the masks, the hand gel, and the testing. So there will be something else. But I think, you know, there's not much. You know, no one has much cash to tie up in this. But tying up too much cash could be risky. I think it's perhaps optimistic to predict a Roaring Twenties style boom. Maybe that's just my optimism. But I think there will be a boom in 3/4 of 2021. I think it's therefore pretty feasible to predict a modest revival at worst. And I think that will help the well-geared and well-structured, which most of you are, lift out. Unfortunately, I think the poorly geared or poorly structured will probably be left behind because they just won't be able to lift out. And that might be the final nail if they're still there. And regret, we have seen quite a lot of failures in January already. And I think probably my final point is that I think it is possible to plan now and to take action. I really do believe it is, as long as the assumptions are agile, because the situation is so changeable. And I think as long as we kind of constantly scrutinize them as well, which we will be doing. So I think I'm on time. I wondered, there was a little bit, maybe it was my final beg. Well, that's nice, Joe. Without optimism, we're all doomed. And we are definitely without optimism, and it's our jobs as business leaders to be glass half full, guys and girls. But hopefully that is of some interest and helps people kind of try to be optimistic, but also try to look at things in phases and tries to give some views on the different dynamics by which the decisions will be made over the forthcoming year.